Do not pass judgment on anyone unless you have talked to them one-on-one. I don't care what the story is.
Most people know Michael Jackson as the king of pop. The moonwalk, the sold-out stadiums, the record-breaking albums. But there's something about Michael that still surprises a lot of people to this day. One of the greatest musicians who ever lived couldn't create music the way most people imagine a musical genius would. He didn't walk into recording studios carrying pages of sheet music. He didn't sit at a piano writing notes onto paper. In fact, many people have spent years claiming that Michael Jackson couldn't properly read or write music notation at all. And that raises a fascinating question. How does someone create songs like Billie Jean, Beat It, Smooth Criminal, Black or White, and Thriller without using the traditional language of music? How does a man who wasn't known for reading sheet music end up creating some of the most recognizable songs in human history? The answer is what made Michael Jackson different from almost everyone else. Because Michael didn't see music the way most musicians did. He heard it. Entire songs would appear in his mind. The drums, the bass line, the strings, the harmonies, even the tiny sounds most listeners never notice.
Actually, you're becoming like a stage addict. I really am. Like when there are off days and there is no show, I'm up at night dancing just to sing.
Long before a song was recorded, Michael could already hear it playing inside his head. And when the people around him witnessed this process for themselves, many were left completely stunned. What they saw wasn't a man limited by not reading music. It was a man operating on a completely different level, and the way Michael Jackson transformed those ideas into some of the biggest hits of all time might be the most fascinating part of his genius. Michael Jackson didn't need sheet music because he had something else, his voice. And I'm not talking about singing, I'm talking about the way he used his voice to build entire songs from scratch. According to many of the musicians and producers who worked with him, Michael would often walk into a studio with a complete song already living inside his head. The problem wasn't creating the music. The problem was getting everyone else to hear what he was hearing. So he developed his own language. He would beatbox drum patterns. He would hum bass lines. He would sing string arrangements. He would imitate guitars, horns, percussion, and even sound effects using nothing but his mouth. At first, it sounds almost unbelievable, but there are actual recordings of Michael doing exactly that. Listen closely to some of his demo tapes and you'll hear him creating entire musical arrangements with his voice years before the finished songs were released. People who worked with him often described the experience as watching a human recording studio. Instead of handing musicians a piece of paper, Michael would sing every part to them. The drum beat, the rhythm, the melody, the background vocals, sometimes even the smallest details. And somehow, the musicians knew exactly what he meant. That's what made his creative process so unusual. Most artists write songs and then figure out the production later. Michael often heard the production first. The song already existed in his mind before anyone else could hear it. But what happened inside the studio shocked even some of the most experienced musicians in the business. Because Michael wasn't just hearing songs, he was hearing entire worlds of sound. What's remarkable is that this wasn't just Michael Jackson talking about his creative process. The people who worked with him witnessed it firsthand, and many of them spent years trying to explain what they had seen. One of those people was Brad Buxer, a musician and producer who worked closely with Michael for years. According to Buxer, Michael could hear entire arrangements in his head before a song was ever recorded. He didn't just come up with a melody and leave the rest to the producers. He already knew what the drums should sound like, how the bass should move, where the strings should enter, and how the harmonies should fit together. His challenge wasn't creating the music. His challenge was translating what he heard in his mind so everyone else could hear it too. To do that, Michael would often sing every part himself. He would perform drum patterns with his mouth, hum bass lines, sing string arrangements, and demonstrate rhythms until the musicians understood exactly what he wanted. It was an unusual process, but according to the people in the room, it worked incredibly well. Instead of handing out sheet music, Michael became the sheet music. Others who worked with him described similar experiences. Quincy Jones, who helped produce some of Michael's most successful albums, frequently praised his musical instincts and attention to detail. What impressed people wasn't just his creativity, it was the accuracy of what he was hearing. Michael wasn't throwing out random ideas and hoping they worked. He often arrived with a clear vision of the finished record long before the recording process began. And perhaps the most surprising part is that Michael never seemed concerned about whether his method was traditional or not. He wasn't trying to prove that he could read music, and he wasn't interested in fitting into anyone else's definition of a musician. He simply trusted his ears. If he heard something in his head, he found a way to communicate it. For many people, that sounds impressive enough. But the real proof of Michael's genius would eventually emerge from something far more revealing. the original demo recordings. Because when those recordings surfaced, they showed just how close the songs in Michael's mind were to the global hits the world would eventually hear. The strongest proof of Michael Jackson's musical genius wasn't an interview, a magazine article, or even praise from the people who worked with him. It was the demo recordings themselves. Over the years, several of Michael's original demos have surfaced, giving fans a rare glimpse into how his songs began before they became global hits. And what makes these recordings so fascinating is how much of the finished song was already there from the very beginning. Take Billie Jean, for example. Long before it became one of the most famous songs ever recorded, Michael already had the rhythm, the vocal phrasing, and the overall feel of the track locked into his mind. The finished version would later benefit from world-class production, but the foundation was already there. The same thing happened with other songs throughout his career. One of the most striking examples is Who Is It? In recordings from the song's development, Michael can be heard creating intricate rhythms and vocal patterns entirely with his voice. What sounds like a full arrangement is often just Michael layering sounds, ideas, and melodies together, long before musicians added the final instruments. People sometimes assume that producers created Michael Jackson's music and that Michael simply sang the vocals. But many of the demos tell a very different story. They reveal an artist who was deeply involved in every stage of the creative process. The producers helped bring the vision to life, but the vision itself often came from Michael. That's what makes these recordings so important. They allow us to hear the music before the polishing, before the mixing, and before the millions of records sold around the world. They let us hear the raw ideas exactly as they existed inside Michael's imagination. And perhaps most impressive of all is how accurate those ideas were. The songs didn't begin as vague sketches that needed to be rescued in the studio. In many cases, the demos already contained the DNA of the final masterpiece. The producers weren't building the songs from scratch. They were helping Michael translate what he was already hearing. But as incredible as that sounds, it also raises another question. If Michael couldn't rely on traditional music notation, how was he able to communicate such complex ideas to some of the best musicians in the world and get exactly the sound he wanted? This is where one of the biggest misconceptions about Michael Jackson begins to fall apart. Many people hear that Michael couldn't properly read or write traditional music notation and immediately assume that meant he lacked formal musical knowledge. But those are two completely different things. Reading music is a skill. Creating music is a different skill entirely. History is filled with talented musicians who relied more on their ears than on sheet music, and Michael Jackson may be one of the greatest examples. He understood rhythm, melody, harmony, arrangement, and emotion at an incredibly high level. He simply processed those ideas differently. In fact, some people who worked with Michael believed that his ability to think beyond traditional musical rules actually helped him. Instead of approaching songs like a trained composer staring at notes on a page, Michael approached music as pure sound and feeling. He focused on what moved people emotionally, rather than what looked correct on paper. That mindset can be heard throughout his catalog. Michael was obsessed with details that many listeners never consciously notice. The way a drum hit created tension, the way a vocal harmony added emotion, the way a tiny sound effect could make a chorus feel bigger. He listened to music almost like a filmmaker building a scene. And because he trusted his ears so completely, he wasn't limited by the idea of what music was supposed to be. He experimented constantly. He mixed sounds in unusual ways. He layered rhythms and vocals until they created something unique. Many of the choices that made Michael Jackson records stand out came from instinct rather than theory. That's why the conversation shouldn't really be about what Michael couldn't do. It should be about what he could do. Millions of people can read sheet music. Very few can hear a song in their head and transform it into a record that captivates the entire world. And that's exactly why so many musicians who worked with Michael left those sessions amazed. Because they weren't witnessing someone compensate for a weakness. They were witnessing a completely different kind of musical intelligence. But there was one moment that may demonstrate Michael's creative genius better than anything else. A moment that reveals how some of his biggest songs were born from nothing more than an idea, a rhythm, and the sounds he carried inside his head. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about Michael Jackson's creative process is that some of the biggest songs in music history began in complete silence. There was no orchestra, no band, no producer sitting beside him, just Michael and an idea. Again and again, people who worked with him described the same pattern. A rhythm would suddenly come to him, a melody would appear in his mind. Sometimes it happened at home, sometimes while traveling, sometimes in the middle of the night. Whenever inspiration struck, Michael would do everything possible to capture it before it disappeared. He treated musical ideas like treasure because he understood something many artists learn the hard way. Inspiration doesn't wait. Over the years, Michael developed a habit of recording ideas as soon as they arrived. He would sing melodies, beatbox rhythms, hum bass lines, and build rough versions of songs using nothing but his voice. What sounds simple on paper was actually an extraordinary skill. Most people can hear a melody. Michael could hear an entire record. That's why so many collaborators described him as a composer trapped inside a singer's body. When listeners hear a finished song like Billie Jean or Smooth Criminal, they're hearing the polished version. They're hearing the result of countless hours in the studio. But long before the engineers, producers, and musicians became involved, Michael already knew what he wanted people to feel. He knew where the tension should build. He knew when the energy should explode. He knew which sounds would make people want to dance. And perhaps most importantly, he knew how to make a song feel alive. That's a rare gift. Technology can help create music. Producers can improve music. Musicians can perform music. But none of those things can replace imagination. And Michael Jackson had imagination on a level that even some of the greatest musicians in the world struggled to explain. Which is why, decades later, people are still studying the way he worked. Not because he followed the rules, but because he proved that sometimes the most extraordinary artists create their own. When people talk about Michael Jackson's talent, they usually focus on the things they can see. The moonwalk, the performances, the music videos, the sold-out stadiums. But after looking at how he actually created music, I think one of the most remarkable things about Michael happened long before he ever stepped onto a stage. It happened inside his mind. For years, people have pointed out that Michael Jackson wasn't known for reading or writing music in the traditional sense. Some have even used that fact to question his abilities as a musician. But the reality tells a very different story. Michael didn't need sheet music to tell him where the music was. He could already hear it. He heard rhythms where other people heard noise. He heard melodies before they existed. He heard complete arrangements long before they reached a recording studio. Then he found a way to share those sounds with the people around him. And somehow, those sounds became Billie Jean, Thriller, Beat It, Smooth Criminal, Black or White, and dozens of other songs that continue to inspire generations of listeners. That's what makes his story so fascinating. Michael Jackson wasn't a great musician because he followed the traditional path. He became one of the greatest because he trusted his own. And maybe that's the biggest lesson from his creative process. Genius doesn't always look the way people expect it to. Sometimes it doesn't arrive on a sheet of paper. Sometimes it arrives as a rhythm, a melody, or a voice that refuses to leave your head until the rest of the world hears it too. And decades later, that's exactly why Michael Jackson's music still feels alive. Because before it became history, it was imagination.